Hello, and welcome to episode number 114 of the Point of Convergence podcast. As always, I am your host, ExoAcademian. Many a UFO enthusiast, researcher, and activist has experienced frustration at the slow pace of ufological uptake in mainstream society. Truth be told, however, while this topic has indeed struggled to gain traction in the mainstream, this is not just because of the success of the dedicated 80-year-long cover-up and disinformation campaign run by elite elements of the U.S. government. It's also because the activity of the UFO phenomenon itself stretches the bounds of expectation and is sometimes even self-negating in nature. Let's stop and consider an important point here. To be clear, human beings don't simply accept things as they arise prima facie. These data, that is to say, all phenomenological experiences, are first passed through a filter of interpretation, and if the phenomena being considered don't match some aspect of a pre-existing map, they're often blocked altogether, or at the very least placed in some black box of quote-unquote things to consider later when there's more evidence. In the instance of this last case, however, the irony is that what counts as more evidence, quote-unquote, is data that fits within the original interpretation framework, which is exactly why the data was put in a black box to begin with, because it didn't. And so we end up in a paradoxical logic trap. No matter how much data of this sort accumulates, it will never meet this arbitrary threshold. This is precisely why too much wooden adherence to our model of reality gets in the way of us actually correctly tracking for and understanding reality. Some observers have recognized that this may actually point to a scheme being employed by the intelligences behind these phenomena, effectively allowing them to continue to operate with impunity at the fringes of human awareness without their activity ever being reckoned with on some official, and that is to say, collective level. Many have argued that this is a sign of deception on the part of these non-human intelligences. These people often go a step further, stating that this deception points squarely towards a nefarious and malevolent NHI agenda. It's important to stop and ask, though, is this true? Should we be so quick to make these logical leaps? And furthermore, and perhaps even more to the point, is it possible that the very questions we're asking, framed within binary thinking, might be leading us further astray? Indeed, one of the unquestioned axioms of the dominant Western paradigm make it the least likely to apprehend the overarching reality here. These are the very complex but consequential questions we'll seek to engage with in this, the 114th episode of the Point of Convergence podcast. As we begin this week's episode, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you would like to support my work, and in so doing gain access to all of my content, which includes Point of Convergence, Liminal Frames, and Event Horizon, as well as premium content including the feature series I create and OTC Squared, as well as early access and discounts to online courses I offer, as well as in-person retreats, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian, or by subscribing on Spotify. All right, with that preamble aside, let's move on to today's topic. I decided to title this week's episode, Seeping from the Periphery, Tracking the Signature of an Elusive Self-Negating Enigma. I think this will take us in some interesting directions, and I would like us to ask some questions that are perhaps atypical within ufology, within the UFO community in general. Much of this will have to do with how we make sense of the UFO phenomenon and how we bring certain unquestioned assumptions to the table when we try to understand these diverse phenomena. And speaking of that, this is where I always like to insert my disclaimer, pointing out that while we colloquially call this the UFO phenomenon, which is a singular reference, we're actually talking about many different kinds of experiences with many different kinds of beings, as well as, and this gets even more complicated when we try to make sense of it, different factions of the same beings that might have either quite different agendas or even subtly different agendas. The challenge, of course, is that because this is the outlier in the public's mind, what ends up happening is whatever fits within this general topic gets lumped together. And then people try to make sense of it based on that broad data set. The challenge with that, of course, is that if there are different actors within that totality acting with different agendas, different intentions, that will be obscured by the fact that we've thrown it all together. So I think this, again, asks for nuance. That's something I do here, do it also on the other podcasts that I'm a part of. We're going to definitely do that today. So that's the first thing we need to acknowledge. There are different kinds of beings, and within that, there are some of the same beings, but in different factions. We have to recognize there could be different things going on. I think there are different things going on. Even the U.S. government has kind of hinted at the fact that there are different kinds of beings, maybe even from different origin sources. Now, the next thing I want to address is the fact that in addition to that complication, we also bring all sorts of things to the table that impact how we interpret this phenomenon, and we don't acknowledge those things, not necessarily because we're being stubborn, but often because they're like the glasses we're wearing, or we're the fish swimming in the water that we can't see. We have no knowledge of the water we're swimming in because we've always been swimming in it. So that is to say, to be human is to have certain default understandings of the way reality works. But even beyond that, to be a person who's a part of Western civilization is to live within certain expectations, assumptions about the nature of reality. And that is particularly problematic when it comes to this data set. And this has been discussed before. I have certainly talked about this. You look at other kind of indigenous circles and the way that they deal with these things. You look at shamanic history and how they deal with these things. Those traditions seem to be a much more natural fit to this kind of data. And that itself is fascinating and should make us pause and ask if the very tools we're bringing to bear to try to make sense of this are not only insufficient, but are sometimes leading us in the wrong directions altogether. And then the question is, do we have enough of us within this community asking those questions so as to perhaps help us correct course? Now, in a few moments, we're going to dive into some of the assumptions, some of the axioms that are built into our Western civilization's understanding of the nature of the world, built into this reductionistic materialist or physicalist model. And actually teasing out some of those elements will help us, I think, become more aware of how we might be missing things or misframing things because of those axioms without recognizing that that's the origin of the problem. But in addition to us trying to understand the phenomenon ontologically, there's also questions about trying to make sense of the behavior of these beings. Now, of course, in various fields of study, we've been warned about this. It's dangerous to make claims about, assumptions about the behavior, the intentions of other beings when we might not have any frame of reference. And we shouldn't assume that just because such and such would mean something to us, that it means that to them. At the same time, I want to make the point here that because there has been telepathic communication, we actually do have some sense, I would argue, about what these beings are here for, what they're trying to do. Of course, that's often not considered within Western civilization's engagement with these matters because telepathy is outside the bounds of what's considered proper data. So again, this is part of the problem. But in addition, there are people even within our community who might be open to some of those elements, but they look at what the phenomenon or the intelligences behind the phenomenon are not doing, and they draw conclusions based on that. And I think that's dangerous. I think that is, at the very least, incredibly presumptive. So without naming names, I'll just say that I read something on social media this past week that speaks to this very point. Someone said, quote, "Whatever UFOs are, they don't rescue people, they don't share knowledge preventing the world's pollution or give clean energy. They don't conduct relief operations when there is a tsunami or a drought. They didn't stop any of the 2060 nuclear explosions. Let that sink in," unquote. And we might say mic drop, because clearly this person thinks that that history, that data, is pointing to something about their intentions, something we can reasonably conclude about their nature and their intentions towards us, their way of thinking about us. I think that's riddled with assumption. As much as I understand where this person's coming from, I understand the temptation to do that, but they are not us. And beyond that question about a cross-species kind of miscommunication that might happen, there's also the issue of scale and scope. What I mean by this is, I think there's a lot of evidence pointing to the fact that these beings are interested in much larger issues than resolving our small disputes and our real-time concerns. Now, within this framework, I can understand how we are overwhelmed with some of the challenges we're facing. They certainly do seem overwhelming. But I would argue, and others have argued this as well, that at least the more ascendant ones of these beings are more concerned with the bigger picture, who we are as a people, as a species. Are we learning the lessons that will allow us to eventually join this cosmic community? And coming in and fixing all of our problems, like parents going in and doing that with a preschool class, doesn't help us grow up. It doesn't help us deal with things, work them through, find some sort of collective understanding, work to transmute energy, I would say, and then actually arrive at a much more wise iteration of ourselves. In other words, it does them no good to keep coming in and putting out fires if that doesn't help us actually mature. Furthermore, I would argue, and I think we could say that they have argued this when they've spoken to different experiencers, they are interested in that. They are interested in who we become. In fact, they would say the entire purpose of this exercise, of any of us being here, is so that we will learn to work with energy, learn to understand our connection with everyone and everything around us. And once we have that perspective, then not only are we more kind to ourselves and to the planet and to the biosphere, but then we also demonstrate that we're ready to join this cosmic community. And it makes sense to me that until then, they would be hands off. Again, not just because they don't like to interfere, but because to interfere here would be to basically overrule the entire point of the exercise. So that also gets to questions around what is the nature of reality? Why are we here at all? What does any of this mean? And I think, of course, these questions are inherently connected to this phenomenon. In fact, what's fascinating, and I've said this before, is that many people begin by having some interest in UFOs and aliens in kind of a sci-fi kind of way, but eventually they end up on the so-called consciousness train, asking much bigger questions about the nature of reality, the purpose of life, any life, etc. So that's where we're going, and I think that's where we need to go when we do an honest reckoning with the data. Now, of course, part of the challenge there is that this comes down to what data we consider appropriate. I kind of hinted at in the introduction there that there's this kind of logic trap where unless your data matches to some sort of map, then that data either gets excluded entirely or put in a box where it'll only be considered when there's a certain amount of data. But then, of course, we mean a different kind of data because that data isn't considered legitimate. So even if there's a lot of data that accrues over time, it will never reach that threshold and be dealt with. I would say that's where we are. The issue is not actually a lack of data. It's the kind of data and the implications of that data that are the primary problem here. Now, in addition to the fact that we have to rely on data, look to data that might be considered illegitimate to some people, especially those coming from a reductionistic materialist kind of perspective, I also want to point out that there are real issues here with how they show up, and not because they're trying to be deceptive necessarily, but because I really think there are issues to do with perception here and the way that things actually manifest differently. We have long assumed that what we perceive is base reality. We have all sorts of evidence coming out of physics, astronomy, neuroscience, etc., suggesting that's not true. But in addition, even beyond that, there are issues to do with the way that we only perceive some parts of reality. So not only are we not perceiving base reality, but even within the band we do see, there are limitations. And this has to do with, again, perception, consciousness, these kinds of issues, and the fact that some of the assumptions we bring to the table are incorrect. So I would like to point out that when it comes to NHI encounters, it's helpful to remember that perception is filtered through neurological firewalls, dimensional veils, and what we might call frequency gates. This being the case, we shouldn't be surprised by how this often operates at the fringes of awareness. That is to say, the UFO phenomenon operates at the fringes of awareness. Now, I do think there's reasons to believe that they're trying to do this in a clandestine manner. I'm just pointing out that that's not all that's operational here. There are also issues to do with our neurology is only set up to perceive a certain kind of reality. Then we have dimensional veils, like entirely different scopes that we have access to. And in addition to that, frequency gates, which by that I mean this speaks to the general notion that just as with how little of the electromagnetic spectrum we perceive, there are entire realityscapes coexisting with us, but coalescing or manifesting at different frequencies, so at bands of existence that we don't perceive at all. And again, what's fascinating is even physics points in this kind of direction, that space and time are illusory. Therefore, if you think about it, everything's kind of happening all at once in one place. And what we have access to is based on something very different than is taught in conventional circles. Again, within the dominant Western paradigm. And now, speaking of the dominant Western paradigm, I'd now like to get into the axioms that are brought to the table, but again, in a way that's never stated outright, that may be problematic here. I think are problematic. As I said a few minutes ago, I think there's reasons why shamanic cultures, indigenous cultures, do better with this data. They don't immediately dismiss it, mock it, stigmatize it, explain it away, because they have a model of reality, a map that already has a place for this. And that makes a huge difference. Again, this gets to the point I made in the introduction, where part of the challenge in gaining traction in the mainstream within the West is that this just doesn't play well with our current dominant reality paradigm, with the map we have of reality. Okay, so let's jump into some of the limitations of the dominant Western paradigm and how I see them as being problematic when it comes to this particular kind of data set. So let's start with our first axiom, materialism or physicalism. The axiom here is that only the physical, quote unquote, is real. Consciousness arises from matter. This is, of course, what the dominant paradigm believes. The effect of this is that experiences that don't fit into a purely physical framework, things like telepathy, consciousness without a body, or interdimensional phenomena, are dismissed as hallucinations, errors, or, you've heard this a lot, pseudoscience. This makes it nearly impossible for mainstream inquiry to seriously engage with non-material entities or effects. But we all know that much of this presents in exactly that kind of manner. And again, that's why we have this problem, that while there's an enormous amount of data at this point, it's not the kind of data that the dominant paradigm is willing to consider. All right, axiom number 2, empiricism is the sole arbiter of truth. So the axiom being truth must be verifiable through repeatable, objective experiments. The effect of this is that anomalous experiences are often singular, subjective, or resistant to replication. So the tools of Western science are often misaligned with the very nature of the phenomena, leading to their categorization as quote-unquote unreal or quote-unquote unscientific. Again, think about all of the assumptions here. Think about how these axioms, again, which are unstated, they're just believed to be the bedrock of reality, so why would we even have to look at them? But of course, the issue is, the challenge is, and kind of the hilarity of it all, is that people are having real experiences of this kind, and it's not being taken seriously because the model, the map can't account for it. Not that it's not happening, because clearly it's happening. All right, next we have the notion of linear time and causality. This also runs into major issues with this particular kind of data. So the axiom being that time flows in one direction and one direction only, and cause always precedes effect in a linear sequence. So the effect here is that phenomena like precognition, retrocausality, or contact that seems to collapse past, present, future are rejected or poorly understood. Western paradigms aren't well equipped to interpret experiences outside this particular temporal frame. Now, of course, what's interesting here is we're finally seeing some malleability here because mainstream science is beginning to reckon with this fact. Of course, quantum mechanics, the revelations of the quantum mechanical revolution, say exactly this, that really space and time are illusory, and that even something like local realism is, again, just a phantasm. It's not real. It's just an artifact of our perception. Now, while that's acknowledged by some of these theoretical physicists, it's still not really being reckoned with, even within science, let alone within mainstream society. So therefore, it's not surprising that this is still an issue and still rubs up against the nature of the kinds of experiences people have with what we call, colloquially, the UFO phenomenon. All right, next up we have individualism and separation. So the axiom here is that the self is discrete, bounded, that is, bordered, and separate from others and the environment. So the effect here is that many contact experiences involve a dissolving of the self, merging with another kind of organism or intelligence, or participation in a collective consciousness. These ideas are alien, pun intended, to the dominant Western psyche. How can you possibly share in a consciousness with other beings if your consciousness is only produced by your brain? And how could you possibly be picking up signals outside of the skull when everything supposedly happens only within the skull and the neurochemical firings of the physical brain? This is a problem. Again, many people do have these experiences. Even people like Dean Radin and Ions have demonstrated these effects, even outside of the UFO phenomenon. But again, because the implications are inconvenient, it's not really considered. Another issue is binary thinking. I mentioned this in the introduction. So here the notion is things must be either this or that. In other words, we end up with these binary dichotomies like real, fake, true, false, us, them. So the effect here being the UFO phenomenon is often forced into false binaries, ET or hoax, machine or spirit, threat or ally, friend, when it may be liminal, paradoxical, or defy categories altogether. And in fact, this might be part of the exercise altogether, is to begin to collapse some of these categories that are putting us into these bottlenecks that are causing some of the major societal problems we're running into. So this kind of thinking obscures nuance and multi-layered truth, and yet the phenomenon points to that over and over again. Now, I already mentioned how I think it's dangerous to try to apply our thinking to them and think if we were good people, we would step in and do such and such. And when they don't do that, we therefore draw conclusions about their character or their feelings about us. That's problematic for reasons I already pointed to. But of course, undergirding this is this notion of human exceptionalism, the idea that we can very well compare them to us because we're the pinnacle. We're the peak of intelligence in the universe as far as we know, and so therefore it's completely applicable that we would assume sophisticated intelligence would act like, behave like us. That's problematic. So the axiom being humans are the pinnacle of intelligence and evolution. The effect here is that this makes it hard to accept the possibility of civilizations perhaps far more advanced, not just technologically, but also in terms of consciousness or beingness, if you will. So again, we hear silly arguments from people saying that space is just too vast, there's no way they could get here, even if they were traveling at close to the speed of light. Now, people like Carl Nell have been hard at work helping to dispel those notions, pointing out that we already, in theory, can conceive of faster-than-light travel. It's just an issue of engineering now. That's the first thing. But beyond that, as we just pointed to, the understanding from the most cutting-edge physicists is that space-time is actually some sort of epiphenomenon arising from some deeper structure. So may it not be possible that these beings, these intelligences, are operating at that level that is a substructure, a substrate level to the one that we perceive? And in fact, if they are indeed perhaps much more sophisticated than us, then shouldn't we expect that? Wouldn't it be more logical that they would do things that do look magical to us, just like Arthur C. Clarke said? We've talked about this. The issue here really comes down to hubris. We just can't step off this pinnacle and consider possibilities beyond that, perhaps well beyond that. And this is again why people like Carl Nell have made the point that based on the disparate ages of different parts of the cosmos, some civilizations might have sprung up in relatively stable parts of the cosmos, relatively stable galaxies. Even within our galaxy, some systems are much older than others. That being the case, we should in fact expect that we would have, with the incredible complexity and size and scope of the cosmos, perhaps many civilizations that would have sprung up, survived, and arrived at a much more sophisticated understanding of reality. This goes without saying, but I feel like it's important to point this out just to give people some sense of scope here. Think about how much our species has changed technologically in 100 years. It's unfathomable, really, to think about how much it would change in 1,000 years, especially from now to 1,000 years in our future, because, of course, this pace of change is becoming exponential. So it's not at the same rate it was from the year 1000 to 2000. We are approaching this technological singularity because we're seeing exponential growth technologically. So again, as Carl would point out, picture a species hundreds of thousands, millions, even billions of years more advanced than us. That would be so discombobulating that we probably would even recognize it as technology. We might not even recognize it as happening, even while it happens in our midst, even if those signs are often, again, on the periphery. Hence why I called this episode Seeping from the Periphery. That's exactly the kind of data I think we should expect would arise because of the disparate nature of these different civilizations and their histories. All right, so now we've named some of the axioms within the dominant Western paradigm and how those particular axioms perhaps don't play well with some of this data. In fact, I think you can make the argument that the very reason this data has not gained traction, and again, this goes beyond the fact that the government has tried to cover this up, some elements of the government, but beyond that, the nature of the data is such that it does not play well with some of those axioms. And because humans don't like cognitive dissonance, we don't like that experience of realizing we don't know much, we would rather explain away or dismiss this data than take it seriously if the implication of that means that we have to reconsider our understanding of reality. Now let's get back to this notion about the agendas, the intentions of these beings, what we can glean from the behavior we see, especially in light of the challenge we face when it comes to some of the axioms I just outlined. Now, I earlier on quoted someone who really questioned whether or not these beings mean us well based on what they haven't done to intervene so far. There are other people that have also talked about the fact that this does seem to happen at the margins, again, seeping from the periphery, as I referred to it. And they have argued that that may be signs of them actually showing deceptive tendencies. I think an ongoing question we have to wrestle with here is this just the nature of the enterprise, the way that these two very different realities might intersect? May it be that only some kinds of data easily track for us, and that's why we're only seeing limited data? Or is it that they are literally trying to be clandestine? Now, again, I think that you can argue that they are trying to be clandestine. They're trying to be secretive, if you will. They don't want to come in and make it obvious that they're here and interacting with us. But again, I think we have to be careful about making conclusions, drawing conclusions about what that means in terms of how they actually feel about us and what they're ultimately trying to do. Now, this notion of deception based on this apparent clandestine behavior goes back a long ways. In fact, one of the first people to talk about this, to suggest this, is Jacques Vallée. So in 1979, he penned a book called The Messengers of Deception. That says it all, basically, when you think about that title. Although before I read this quote, I want to point out that Jacques' been in this for decades, longer than pretty much anybody. And he shifted quite a bit from the kinds of things he was saying back in the 60s and 70s and what he's been saying more recently. More recently, he seems to be suggesting that there is this kind of Zen-like or consciousness-raising kind of endeavor going on here, that they are trying to interact with us in such a way as to raise our consciousness. So that's almost the polar opposite of some of the earlier claims he made or the other ideas he kind of entertained. And I just want to point out that's perfectly fine with me. I've made some shifts in the time that I've been studying this, and I haven't studied it nearly as long as Jacques has. And I think that it's to his credit that he's been willing to shift his perspective, evolve his perspective as he's had longer to think about it and really sit with, meditate on the data, and even gather more data over time. Okay, but all that said, let's go back to 1979 when Jacques penned Messengers of Deception. This is what he said in that book, quote, The phenomenon is not only evasive, it seems to have a built-in self-destruct mechanism. Just when you think you're getting close to understanding it, it turns absurd, unquote. So, again, Vallée, someone I've mentioned on this podcast more than anyone else, is one of our most influential thinkers in this field, perhaps the most influential, I would argue. And he's suggesting here that it seems to resist conventional analysis and categorization, the phenomenon that is. This idea plays a key role in his broader non-extraterrestrial hypothesis, if you want to call it that. He calls it different things, but basically he came to the conclusion early on, within a few years of researching this, that the extraterrestrial hypothesis was simply too simple-minded to explain the complexity of what he was observing and what the data seemed to represent. So he went on to suggest that UFOs might not be spacecraft from other planets after all, but rather a manifestation of a control system or a phenomenon that interacts with human consciousness and belief systems. So much more abstract in that sense and responsive to our behavior, but always tricky to pin down because it's basically responsively manifesting based on what we do, perhaps to subtly change the course of our civilization. And again, I would suggest that over time, Jacques has warmed up to the idea that some of these beings are doing this with goodwill, with the desire for us to arrive at a more unitive kind of consciousness, and one that can interact and join this larger cosmic community. But the point here is because it's a responsive control structure, he's used this analogy of a thermostat, an automatic thermostat that goes up and down based on the temperature of the room, that we can't look at it directly. We can only see its indirect effects. So it's kind of like how you can look outside and realize it's windy because you see flags blowing and leaves falling and that kind of thing. So it's only indirect. And because of that, the way it manifests can change over time and therefore be kind of self-negating. In other words, if we see A happen and then later on observe B, we might conclude that doesn't make any sense. Maybe nothing's happening at all. These seem to cancel each other out. Are these different entities? There's numerous ways you could try to interpret that. But his point is, again, in addition to what we've already addressed, where the very way this manifests already challenges our understanding of reality, but beyond that, you have behavior, activity that seems to change, sometimes even be the polar opposite of earlier behavior. And that leads some people who, again, like easily categorizable kind of data to say, well, nothing's really happening here. This must just be noise because it even seems to negate itself or contradict itself. But again, that is an assumption we're bringing to the table. Maybe the noise is the data we need to be paying attention to. Maybe the noise is only being considered noise because we don't know how to make sense of it yet. In the same way that we used to say for a long time that huge aspects of our DNA was quote-unquote junk DNA. Amazing arrogance there, that we assume that because we can't make sense of it, it must serve no purpose whatsoever, and so we think it's completely legitimate to call this junk DNA, quote-unquote. Similar things might be happening here, where what looks like noise to us might actually be a pattern, even a kind of communication that we just don't yet have the key to translate or make sense of. At least not yet. Now, earlier on, we talked about the axioms that undergird Western paradigms about reality. And again, this becomes problematic here, and that's why I pointed it out, because some of the conclusions we draw really could point to those axioms and question the sufficiency of them, the legitimacy of them. But because we, again, assume they must be true, unquestioned really, we assume that if we have data that points to them as problematic, then it must be the data that is faulty. And this has to do with the way we usually conduct science to try to demonstrate the validity of a certain kind of phenomenon. Now, because of its contradictory nature and its apparent resistance to reproducible analysis, the phenomenon effectively prevents itself from being studied seriously by mainstream science. Now, this too might be part of the phenomenon's design, or it could be an artifact of its nature. Again, I would point more to the latter. But the less you look to these axioms as potentially problematic or at least questionable, you're going to lean in the first direction, which is to say, the phenomenon must know that these axioms are trustworthy, and so it will do things that self-negate its own behavior, its own activity, perhaps to get away with something, if you will. A lot of people jump to that kind of conclusion. I would argue, actually, that the latter feels more true to me, that this is just an artifact of its nature, that this apparent contradiction, this apparent self-negation, actually says something about the insufficiency of our model of reality. So again, we have to be careful. When are we making assumptions that lead us prematurely to certain conclusions that in the long run might end up being completely wrong, pointing in the wrong direction altogether? Now, that said, I also want to leave room for the fact that because, again, like I said at the outset, we have many different kinds of beings coming from different origin sources with different agendas, including different factions of the same kinds of beings that might have quite different, or at least subtly different agendas. Because of that, we shouldn't ignore the fact that sometimes there may be a messing with directly the scientific method that we would want to employ so as to stay clandestine, to make it more difficult for us to establish this in our usual method of analysis so that it can remain in the shadows, so to speak. This is very clearly demonstrated in the history of Skinwalker Ranch. People like John Alexander have coined this term, precognitive sentient phenomena. He there is pointing to the fact that some of this intelligence seems to know what they're going to try to measure beforehand and messes with the variables in such a way that it becomes basically impossible for them ever to record the data in terms of data itself. They can observe the data, people experience it, but when they try to measure it, record it, archive it through data that can be subjected to scientific analysis, often that's when the interference apparently comes in. So I don't mean to say this is only an artifact and pointing to the insufficiency of our model. Sometimes some intelligence do seem to try to mess with the variables to make it more difficult for us to establish even their existence, let alone get to the nature of their agenda. So again, we want to have a wide scope here and allow for many different kinds of beings, different kinds of intelligences, but just at the same time, be cautious about how the assumptions we bring to the table often create the problems that we later blame the phenomenon for, the intelligence behind the phenomenon for. So keep an open mind, but beware of the fact that our assumptions, the things we bring to the table, are often the actual issue. Now, speaking of our ability to be aware of this phenomenon, track it, record it, and therefore be able to dialogue about it as a collective, I would be remiss to not mention something like screen memories, where people do actually in their conscious memory either have pieces missing where they don't remember anything happening at all, or if they do have a strange memory, it might involve seeing deer on the side of the road or something like that, or an owl flying over their car. Later on, through something like hypnotic regression, they may remember actually that that was a UFO they were seeing, that the owl, therefore, is a screen memory. Or they may have seen deer on the road, but later on they remember seeing gray aliens who then helped them aboard a craft, and they were subjected to some sort of medical examination and that kind of thing, perhaps to do with the hybridization program, which I've discussed many times. So I'm going to say without doubt, this does happen. I absolutely believe that these screen memories do occur, and that furthermore, I'm quite comfortable saying this is not just an artifact of the brain, that I do think they plant these. The question then becomes, why do they plant these so-called screen memories? Some people will undoubtedly leap almost immediately to nefarious intent, that they know what they're doing is wrong. They don't want to get caught with their hands in the proverbial cookie jar, if you will. And because of that, they're covering it up, just like criminals would do. Now, on the one hand, I can understand that perspective, but I think it would be short-sighted, to say the least, to assume that's the only explanation here. I think we can actually point to some very legitimate reasons why some of this may be happening. Now, again, I want to point out that, once again, we have a broad swath of characters here with different histories, different stages of consciousness that they're arriving at. And so we should expect actually quite a range of behavior and intent, from very selfish to actually quite altruistic. And with that caveat aside, I'd now like to move to a discussion of some of the reasons why I think they may be doing some of these things in admittedly a kind of clandestine manner, but that there could be very legitimate reasons for them doing this. And this would have to do with actually this larger scope of what they're trying to accomplish with us. Again, with this notion that they're not just trying to solve our immediate problems, but trying to mature us over time. And so this would somewhat fit with Jacques Vallée's notion of a control system, which is more interested in these much more overarching goals, less with putting out individual fires, if you will. So how might we frame some of this behavior from a more egalitarian or altruistic kind of lens? Let's start with the notion of minimizing ontological shock. Now, I think all of us can agree that sudden, overt contact would and certainly could destabilize belief systems, institutions, and people all around the world, whereas gradual, ambiguous encounters allow humanity to acclimate slowly, progressively, to paradigm-shattering realizations without widespread psychological or societal collapse. I think you can make that argument quite strongly based on the nature of the change, the transformation that's on the table here. This is not subtle. This is not something that people could add to their understanding on a Sunday. Next, there may be this overarching respect for free will. In fact, this comes up a lot. This is not just wishful thinking here or me just brainstorming. Because again, we have this long history in the lore of communication between these beings and human beings, and they often bring this up, this respect for free will. We also might think about the raw contact material, and there's this clear, not only respect, but almost insistence that free will be honored. And interestingly, in the case of the raw contact material, this means all beings across all of these different stages of consciousness, which they acknowledge are part of the picture. So they basically try to only referee in such a way as to allow everyone to have free will, including the beings that we might perceive as self-serving, as well as the more egalitarian, altruistic kind of beings. And they do this so that we can continue to learn, because the entire purpose of the exercise, being here, being in a body as part of a species, is to learn and to move back to this oneness, to this kind of unitive experience. But to allow for that discovery to happen naturally, you can't intervene too much. You only basically intervene as much as is absolutely necessary, while also honoring and insisting that free will be allowed to have the very important role that it does from their perspective. And so when we think about that in the clandestine behavior, we could recognize here that they may be operating subtly to preserve human autonomy and agency. Again, free will related. By not overtly revealing themselves, these intelligences might be allowing us to choose our own response and to interpret the experiences themselves freely, and to evolve our understanding on our own terms. So rather than showing up and saying, you humans are completely misunderstanding what's going on here and you're excluding all sorts of data you shouldn't, instead they sit back and watch and wait as we, through our own natural process, arrive there ourselves. And you could argue that we are well on the journey towards arriving there. Another possibility that I think we should consider is that this is about catalyzing consciousness expansion. This is something I talk about quite a bit. I certainly discussed it on the most recent episode of Event Horizon. So evasive or even symbolic contact can help support or foster inner growth primarily. Mysteries inspire curiosity, in other words, which in turn fosters higher order thinking. It helps with intuition and spiritual seeking. So this ambiguity may be a kind of spiritual curriculum, if you will, pushing us to stretch beyond the materialist paradigm. So again, in that sense, and this is something Vallée's talked about, Bernardo Kastrup has talked about this, I've also talked about this, the absurd nature of some of the phenomena might be showing up as they do, not just as an artifact of the nature of the phenomenon, but also because they're trying to stretch our understanding. Another possibility that comes up in the UFO community quite a bit as a possibility, although some people don't like this notion, is that they really have an aversion to cultural contamination. In other words, they're trying to avoid cultural contamination. And of course, direct contact risks exactly that. And it would be a kind of cultural colonization. So by remaining on the periphery, They reduce the danger of us modeling our society or science prematurely on theirs without having learned the lessons ourselves again, thus preserving the integrity of our natural developmental cycle. Right, another thing to think about is energetic or dimensional constraints. I referred to this a little bit earlier, but let me be a bit more specific. If their presence is multidimensional or vibrationally incompatible, if you will, with us, then direct interaction may actually be either impossible or potentially harmful. And of course, this fits with some of the lore, because when you think about, again, the creation of the hybrid beings, the notion there that it's discussed between, again, these beings and human beings, between abductees or contactees, depending on what term you'd like to use, is that they themselves have to change their vibrational rate to interact with us, and they don't naturally fit well with the biosphere of the planet. And the idea is that the hybrid beings are actually a combination of us and them. So they have the psychic giftings and the greater unitive awareness that some of these beings have, while also having some of our physiology and some of our communication style that allows them to dwell on the earth in the future and to communicate with human beings, traditional human beings. So in that sense, there may be energetic or dimensional constraints that, at least right now, make it difficult or even potentially harmful for them to interact with us directly. Now, what I want to bring up next is something that I've discussed many times. People who recognize that some of these beings are definitely altruistic and benevolent and also quite a ways beyond us in terms of their consciousness evolution. This has to do with this all being a kind of test of discernment and our readiness, not just individual readiness, but our civilization-wide readiness, so the kind of center of gravity of our consciousness development. So in that sense, the elusive nature might serve as a mirror for our collective maturity. In other words, we can basically take the temperature on our maturity based on how they are interacting with us. How we respond, in other words, fearfully, curiously, manipulatively, or humbly, could be part of an ongoing evaluation of our readiness for deeper contact, deeper and perhaps direct and more enduring contact. Now, some people have pointed out recently, knowing that we are shooting some of these craft down, does that suggest that we are ready for a kind of participatory kind of environment, a unit of experience, ready to take our place at the Galactic Council, if you will? And again, I want to offer my usual caveat. That is not to say that all of these beings are benevolent and highly mature, ethically and morally. Again, I think there's a range. But if you're shooting first and asking questions later, from our perspective, that's problematic and certainly says something about our maturity and our readiness for cooperation. Another possibility to consider here is symbolic language of the subconscious. What kind of role might that play? So we often hear about dreamlike states or a dreamlike nature to these experiences. Sometimes people have some encounters that feel very dreamlike, other ones that feel much more grounded in our everyday experience. Again, I think that points to our lack of understanding about different states of consciousness. And we have this bias where we make one count as real, the daily waking state, and all the other ones as somehow hallucinatory. Again, I think that's problematic and indicative of some of the issues with our current dominant paradigm. So by operating in near dreamlike states or liminal kinds of encounters, using archetypal kind of imagery, they may be using a language the subconscious understands, bypassing intellect to speak directly to the soul, much like we see in myth or visionary art. This is a notion I think we really should consider here. And we've often heard in the lore that they know us better than we know ourselves. And furthermore, counter to popular sci-fi kind of tropes, they often point out that we are very similar, actually, that at our core, we're all splinters of source consciousness. You've heard me say this many times. In that sense, they recognize that because the subconscious is something that connects all of us with this kind of super consciousness, then by speaking directly there, they're able to subtly influence us and do it in such a way where our usual fight or flight response is offline, whereas in the daily waking state it is online. That allows us to get beyond some of our evolutionarily derived animal responses and allow something to bubble up naturally even to the point where we may not acknowledge or recognize that it's arising from interaction with them to begin with. I think that happens quite a lot. So this notion of them interacting with us from the periphery and often at the level of the subconscious makes a lot of sense. And not only does it make a lot of sense, but again, if you look at things from a certain perspective, a certain limited perspective, you might see that kind of behavior as looking shadowy, secretive, or clandestine, when actually they have the wisdom to know that to interact with us at the level of the subconscious is more likely to garner a fruitful and positive and impacting result in the long term. Another reason why they may be opting for this clandestine kind of interaction is that they want to preserve cosmic balance. And by that, I mean that their actions might be part of a larger cosmic ecology, if you will, where interference is minimized to maintain universal harmony. In other words, they act in such a way as to benefit the whole, the greatest numbers of people and beings and the biosphere in general. So subtle influence may be the only ethical, acceptable form of engagement under such principles. And yes, this is related to the notion of the prime directive, although it's more expansive than that kind of limited scope. Another reason why they may be opting to only work from the fringes and at the fringe of human awareness, at the periphery, if you will, is because they are concerned about weaponization or exploitation of the technologies they're working with and introducing if we were aware of them directly. So clear technological demonstrations could be reverse engineered or militarized. In fact, we see lots of evidence that that's already happening with craft retrievals and whatnot. So the elusiveness would serve as a kind of cosmic encryption, if you will, ensuring knowledge is only unlocked when it aligns with an appropriate level, a corresponding level of wisdom, if you will. So I've talked many times about the fact that our technology is run amok and is greatly outpacing our consciousness development. They may be concerned about exactly this kind of misalignment, and they don't want to add to it by showing up directly. Now, of course, that is complicated because some people have suggested that some of this technology has been gifted to us. This is, again, tricky because some people will say, no, we do have EMP kind of weapons that can bring down these craft. There's recently been a suggestion that came out that one of the captured or recovered beings actually told the humans that you can use a certain kind of signature to bring down craft, and apparently that did happen. So I'm not denying that that can happen and indeed probably has happened. But at the same time, I can understand that there'll be some constraints around demonstrating certain kinds of technology because it would be likely misused. And of course, I think we'd all agree they're reading us correctly there. And going back to my caveat at the beginning, we want to allow for a broad assortment of beings at different stages of consciousness. So again, I think it's the more benevolent, ascendant ones that would have these larger concerns about how the technology would be used, if they were even to demonstrate it openly, let alone give it to us. All right, finally, we have this notion of teaching by mystery. I love this. This is kind of like the Zen koan notion that I referenced earlier, where mystery itself can be a transformative force, often is a transformative force. Mystery reminds us that we don't know it all, and because of that, it teaches humility, patience, and openness to the unknown, something that is largely missing from the Western paradigm, I would argue. It's much more embraced, again, in indigenous or shamanic kind of cultures. So a benevolent, ascendant kind of intelligence may understand that revelation too soon would rob us of the sacred fire found only in the long search. Almost like a kind of cosmic game of hide and seek where we are slowly discovering new aspects of reality, but in another way, rediscovering, indeed remembering, I would argue, based on the notions we find in non-dual traditions, this unitive foundation to reality, this source consciousness that I've referenced many times, that is fundamental to who we are and of which we are all splinters of. And on that note, we've come to the close of another edition of the Point of Convergence podcast. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian or by subscribing on Spotify. But until next time, friends, from deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, this is ExoAcademian signing out.